There are moments when ignorance and cruelty arrive in the same sentence and are impossible to fully separate from each other. When something is said that is offensive in the way of a weapon and also in the way of a person who has never been required to understand the weight of the thing they are holding. This is a story about one of those moments. About a word, or rather, about two words combined into a phrase that landed on a stage in front of a family whose name was their history, whose name was their inheritance, whose name was what their people had made of what had been done to them over generations, and about what Steve Harvey did in the 90 seconds after those two words hit the air. It is a story about a family that had not come to be taught a lesson about their own name by someone who did not know its meaning. It is a story about the specific human capacity to be dismissive about something sacred without knowing it is sacred, and about what happens when a room refuses to let that dismissal stand. And it is a story about a woman named Josephine, who has carried that name for 68 years, and who knew exactly what it meant, and who, when someone reduced it to a slur in front of her, sat with a composure that was not absence of feeling but its organization into something permanent and unmovable. Hit that like button and subscribe right now before we go any further, because this channel exists for exactly these stories, stories about dignity and the people who hold it and the people who stand up for it, and we bring one every single week. Now let us meet the Thomas family and talk about what happened on that stage. The Thomas family from Jackson, Mississippi arrived at the Family Feud studio in the fall of 2024 carrying, like all families, more than their preparation and their game show energy. They carried a name. The name was Thomas, a name that had been in their family for 6 generations, a name that traced back to a great-great-great-grandfather named Isaiah Thomas, born into slavery in Mississippi in 1841, who had taken that name as his own at the moment of emancipation in 1865, and who had, in the decades that followed, built something from nothing in the specific way that emancipated people built things from nothing. With work that cost everything, with the fierce, deliberate intention of someone who understood that what they were building was not just a house or a farm or a business, but the proof of something that the world was still, at that time, actively trying to deny. Isaiah Thomas had named himself at the moment he became free to do so. That name had passed through 6 generations of his descendants, as the inheritance it was, not just a label but a statement, a continuous act of self-determination that renewed itself every time another Thomas was born and given the name to carry forward. The team captain was 45-year-old David Thomas, Isaiah's great-great-great-grandson, who was a high school history teacher in Jackson and who therefore had, of all the possible people who could have been standing on that stage when what happened next happened, perhaps the deepest relationship to what was about to occur. He taught the history that surrounded that name. He taught it to young people in Mississippi, which meant he taught it in the specific place where so much of that history had happened, where the ground itself had memory. He was a serious man in the way that people who teach serious things become serious, not humorless, not without warmth, but with the settled, grounded weight of someone who has spent 20 years standing in front of young people and being responsible for making them understand things that mattered. His wife, Keisha, 43, was a social worker who spent her days with families navigating some of the hardest things a family can navigate, and who had developed, through years of that work, the specific combination of empathy and resilience that people develop when they choose, day after day, to be present to other people's hardest moments and to try to make a difference in them. Their son, Andre, 21, was a junior at Jackson State University studying political science. With his father's seriousness and his mother's perceptive warmth, and the focused energy of a young man who has a clear sense of what he wants to do with his life, and who has chosen it rather than stumbled into it. Their daughter Maya, 18, had just started her first year at Spelman College, the historically black women's college in Atlanta, and was home visiting when the taping was scheduled, which had allowed her to join the team and which she had, from the moment she arrived in Atlanta that August, been describing to her new college friends as the most interesting thing that had ever happened to her. And the 5th team member was David's mother, 68-year-old Josephine Thomas, Jo, to everyone who knew her, who had taught 2nd grade in Jackson for 34 years before retiring, and who had, in 34 years of 2nd grade, become one of the most quietly effective human beings that any of her former students had encountered, because she had the specific gift of making every child she taught feel that they were seen individually and completely. which was the whole job and which she had done it every day of 34 years without ever phoning it in. Josephine had been named for her grandmother, who had been named for her grandmother, and the name had been given with intention each time, a particular, deliberate choice. Not just a name, but a thread of continuity in a family that understood continuity as a form of resistance. She wore the name the way she wore everything, without any need for the room's approval of it, without any requirement that other people understand what it meant before she felt secure in it. It was simply hers. It had always been hers. It was going to be hers long after any afternoon in any studio. The competing family that day was the Anderson family from a suburb of Minneapolis, Minnesota. 5 of them, 2 brothers, their wives, and their mother, who had the comfortable, unpretentious warmth of a Midwestern family that liked each other and had been looking forward to the experience without overthinking it. The team captain was 44-year-old Brian Anderson, who was a middle school gym teacher and who had the easy, direct, genuinely friendly energy of someone who has spent 20 years coaching 12-year-olds and who has consequently learned that most social situations benefit from the same approach. Be clear, be warm, don't take yourself too seriously. He was likable in the uncomplicated way. He was also someone who had grown up in and lived his entire life in environments that were overwhelmingly white, which had given him a very thorough understanding of certain things and a very limited understanding of others. And he had the specific limitation of a person who has never had to think carefully about certain kinds of words because those words had never been aimed at him or at anyone he loved and had therefore not required his attention. His mother, 70-year-old Marge Anderson, was the wild card of the Anderson family in the best possible sense. A sharp, cheerful, entirely unself-conscious woman who had raised 4 children and who had opinions about everything and delivered them without any diplomatic overlay, the way people do when they have reached the age where they have decided that the opinions are worth more than the overlay. She was funny in the loud, uncensored way. She was also the person in the room, as it turned out, who did not entirely think before she spoke. The pregame went warmly. Steve Harvey moved through both families with his customary attention and warmth, drawing out the personalities and details that make the game feel human. He spent significant time with the Thomas family, with David, who talked about teaching history in Mississippi with the precise, engaged articulateness of someone who has been explaining why his subject matters for 20 years and has gotten very good at it. With Josephine, who immediately charmed Steve Harvey in the specific way of a retired second-grade teacher, completely, effortlessly, with no particular effort. He asked her about 34 years of second grade. She said it was the best work she had ever heard of and that she was glad she had gotten to do it. Steve Harvey repeated that back to the audience with the emphasis of a man who had just heard something he wanted to make sure people received. He asked her about her name. She said it had been her grandmother's name and her great-grandmother's name, and that she had always loved it. She said it like that, simply and completely, without any preamble or explanation, the way you say something that is simply true and that does not require defense. It was during the brief setup before the first round that Marge Anderson said it. She had been listening to the pregame exchanges with the engaged, slightly loud attention of a woman who participates fully in situations she finds interesting, which was most situations. She had listened to Josephine talk about her name. And then, in the pause before the game began, she said something to her son Brian in the specific half-voiced register of someone who believes they are making a private observation. She said the name Josephine, and then she said, with the unchecked candor of someone who had encountered something she had been taught to think of in a particular way and was applying that teaching without examining it. "Isn't that one of those, you know, a slave name?" She did not say it with cruelty. She said it with the innocent, unexamined certainty of someone repeating a thing they had absorbed somewhere and had never been given occasion to think through. But it landed where it landed, with what it carried, in front of who it was said in front of. Josephine heard it. She heard it the way a person hears a comment about something sacred from someone who does not know it is sacred, with the specific, quiet pain of a person who has just had the thing they love most handled carelessly. Her expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something in her eyes did something that David, standing beside her, recognized immediately, and that made him look toward Steve Harvey before he had consciously decided to. David had heard it. He was a history teacher in Mississippi. He had spent 20 years explaining the history that phrase dragged through, including the specific and important truth about what names meant to enslaved people and what it meant when they chose their own. The affirmative, defiant, permanent act of self-naming at emancipation that Isaiah Thomas had performed in 1865, and that had sent his name forward through 6 generations as both identity and inheritance. He received the phrase in that full historical context and felt it in the specific, complicated way of a person who has spent 20 years trying to give other people accurate understanding of something and who has just had that same something completely misunderstood in front of him. Keisha looked at her mother-in-law. Andre was very still. Maya looked at her grandmother. Josephine had not moved. Steve Harvey had heard it. He had been in motion, transitioning to the start of the game, and then he was not in motion. He stood with the specific, complete stillness of a person who has received something and is deciding in real time what to do with it. He looked at Marge Anderson. He looked at Josephine Thomas. He looked at David. Then he walked to the center of the stage with the calm, unhurried purpose that the studio had come to recognize in the course of this day's taping, as the walk of a man who has something he is going to say, and is going to say all of it. "I'm going to stop," he said, in the voice that was the same voice but with something under it that made it different. "Because something was just said that I heard, and I'm not going to let it go by, because these people deserve better than that, and because the thing that was said deserves a response." He turned to Marge Anderson, who had the startled look of someone who has said something in what they believed was a private register, and who is discovering that the register was not as private as they thought. "A comment was made," Steve said, "about the name Josephine. The comment used a phrase, slave name, that I want to address directly, because I think the comment came from a place of not fully understanding what that phrase does when it lands and what the name it was said about actually means." He turned toward the Thomas family. "I want to tell you something about this family's name," he said. "David, can I ask you, you're a history teacher. Tell me about your family's name, where it comes from." David Thomas looked at Steve Harvey. He took one breath. And then he told the story that he had been telling his students for 20 years, but that he had never told in a room quite like this one, in front of the person whose casual phrase had just required the telling. He told it briefly and clearly, with the economy of a teacher who knows how to make something large comprehensible in a short amount of time. He said his family's name came from his great-great-great-grandfather Isaiah, who was born enslaved in Mississippi in 1841, and who chose the name Thomas at emancipation in 1865. And who chose it as an act of self-definition at the moment when self-definition became legally possible for the first time. He said the name had passed through 6 generations since then. He said his mother had been given the name Josephine by her mother, who had received it from her mother, in a line of deliberate inheritance that went back to women David was still learning the full history of. He said the name was not a relic of slavery. The name was the opposite of slavery. The name was what his family had made of themselves at the moment they became free to make anything. The studio was completely quiet. Steve Harvey looked at Marge Anderson. She was listening. Whatever she had expected this afternoon to be, it had not been this, and her face showed the specific processing quality of someone receiving information that is requiring her to adjust something she has held for a long time. "That phrase," Steve said, "slave name, is used sometimes as if it means a name that came from slavery. But what it misses, what it gets exactly wrong, is that the names black families have carried since emancipation are not the names of their enslavement. They are the names of their liberation. They are the names they chose. They are the names they gave to their children and their children's children as the first act of a free people." He paused. When you hear a name like Josephine, like David or Andre or Maya, and your first thought is that it sounds like a slave name, what you are doing is applying an idea about which names belong to which people that has nothing to do with the history and everything to do with a set of assumptions about what black names mean that black people did not create and did not authorize. He looked at Josephine. "This woman's name is her grandmother's name, and her grandmother's name. And it is the name of a free woman who chose to give it to her daughters as an inheritance. That is what the name is. That is all it is." Marge Anderson was quiet. Her son Brian was looking at the floor. His wife had one hand on Marge's arm, the specific hand of someone who is steadying rather than correcting, because correcting would require a conversation that this was not the moment for, and steadying was what the moment actually called for. Marge said, and it was not a performance, it was a plain statement from a woman who was absorbing something she had not expected to absorb. "I didn't understand what I was saying." Steve Harvey looked at her with the measured attention of someone assessing sincerity. He said, "I believe you, and I'm glad we had this conversation, because understanding is what we are here for." He looked at the Thomas family. "And I want to make sure this family knows that the name they are carrying is a name worth carrying. That every name in this family has a history that is worth knowing, and that nothing that was said today changes any of that. He looked at Josephine specifically. He said, "Joe, you all right?" Josephine Thomas looked at Steve Harvey with the eyes of a woman who has taught second grade for 34 years and who has therefore encountered, in the gentlest possible repeated doses, every human being's capacity for saying the wrong thing without knowing it is wrong, and who has spent 34 years deciding how to respond to that capacity in a way that was both honest and useful. She said, "I'm fine, Steve. I've been fine. My name is my name, and it always has been, and it always will be. Nothing anybody says about it changes what it is." Steve Harvey looked at her for one long moment. Then he said, "That's right." He said it the way a period ends a sentence. Then he straightened and looked at the room and said, "Now, we've got a game to play, and I think this family has some things they'd like to win." The Thomas family played the rest of the game with the specific, grounded energy of people who have just heard their own history told correctly in a room where it needed to be told, and who are now ready to show that the history has produced exactly the kind of people it was always going to produce. David was precise and fast, the history teacher's pattern recognition working in the specific way that 20 years of making sense of large, complicated things trains a mind, finding the structure beneath the surface quickly and following it to the right answer. Keisha was sharp and warm, with the social worker's calibrated understanding of what people in aggregate tended to want and fear. Andre played with the focused, slightly aggressive energy of a junior at a historically black university who has been studying political science, and who has spent the past 3 years reading about power and how it works, and who had just watched power be both misused and corrected in the same 10 minutes, and who had things to say about that, and was going to say them through every buzzer he could reach. Maya, 18 years old, first semester at Spelman, the youngest person on the stage, gave answers with the confident, uncomplicated accuracy of someone who had grown up in this family, with this grandmother, with this history, and who therefore had never had any ambiguity about who she was or what she was worth. And Josephine, when she played with 34 years of second grade in every answer. She knew what people thought. She had always known what people thought because she had spent 34 years being responsible for what children thought and for building the habits of mind that would shape what adults thought. And she had approached both responsibilities with the same steady, unhurried accuracy that she brought to every other part of her life. She gave 3 answers in the 4th round that all landed in the top 5. After the 3rd one, Steve Harvey said, "Where have you been all my life?" Josephine said, "Jackson, Mississippi, teaching 2nd grade." Steve Harvey said, "That is the world's loss." Josephine said, "The children did all right." The audience loved her completely. The Thomas family won the main game. They went a fast money with Keisha going first, who scored 126 points with the clean, calibrated accuracy of someone whose entire professional life had been spent understanding how people worked, and what they needed, and how to read what was actually happening underneath what appeared to be happening. Then Josephine walked to the fast money podium. She walked the way she had walked her entire life, with the unhurried, settled ease of a woman who knows where she is going and does not need to rush to get there because the destination has been clear to her for a long time. She stood at the microphone. She looked at the clock that would appear. She looked at Steve Harvey with the expression of a woman who has been waiting, pleasantly and without urgency, for exactly this moment. Steve said, "This one's for Isaiah." Josephine looked at him. Something moved across her face, something that was not quite a smile and was more than a smile, the expression of someone being seen accurately. She said, "And for all of them." He hit the button. Josephine Thomas answered 5 Family Feud survey questions in 20 seconds with the specific, decisive accuracy of a woman who has spent 34 years knowing what people thought and caring deeply about what they understood. 4 of her 5 answers were the number 1 response on the survey. Her 5th answer was number 2 by a margin of 1 response, one single person out of 100 who had answered differently, which Steve Harvey noted when the board revealed it, and which produced from Josephine the expression of a woman who accepts imperfection without drama. The Thomas family's combined total was 294 points. They had won $20,000. The audience gave them the sustained, full-body response of people who have traveled somewhere together and are releasing the journey along with the celebration. Steve Harvey brought the check to Josephine first, not to David, who was the team captain, but to Josephine, because the afternoon had been about her in the specific way that afternoons sometimes center on the person who was treated carelessly and who responded with the most dignity. And the check in Josephine's hands was the room acknowledging that. She held it, she looked at it, she looked at her family. She looked at Maya, 18 years old, first semester at Spelman, who had just watched her grandmother handle something in a way that Maya was going to carry for the rest of her life and knew it. Josephine said, "Isaiah would have loved this." Steve Harvey said, "I think he's watching." Josephine said, "I know he is. He always has been." The episode aired 5 weeks later. The clip of David's telling of Isaiah's story, the specific historical truth of what self-naming at emancipation meant, delivered by a high school history teacher in Mississippi, who was also the man's great-great-great-grandson, in a studio audience setting, in response to a phrase that had been used without understanding, spread through networks of historians, educators, and people whose families carried similar histories with the specific urgency of people who had been trying to tell this story for years, and who had just watched it told in a setting, and a format that reached people who might not otherwise have received it. Teachers shared it for classroom use. History departments at universities shared it. People who had grown up hearing the phrase slave name applied to their own family names shared it with the specific, personal recognition of someone seeing their experience named accurately in public for the first time. Several historians and scholars of African American history and onomastics, the study of names, wrote extended pieces about the clip that provided the full, rich context of what self-naming at emancipation meant, of the legal and cultural significance of Black Americans' naming practices in the post-Civil War period, of the specific dignity and defiance contained in names that had been given by free people to free children as the first act of a liberated people. The clip, they said, had done in 4 minutes what they had been trying to do in academic papers for years, which was to make a complicated historical truth viscerally, immediately real to people who had never encountered it before. Marge Anderson, in the car ride home, said very little. Her son Brian said she was quiet for a long time and then said that she had not known. He said she had grown up in a world where certain phrases had been in circulation for so long that she had absorbed them without examining them, and that this was not a defense, but it was an explanation, and that she had spent the weeks following the broadcast examining a number of things she had not previously examined, and that he was glad for it, even though the occasion for it had been uncomfortable. He said his mother was not a bad person. He said his mother was a person who had just been required to learn something she should have learned earlier, and that she was, at 70, doing the learning. He said he thought that was worth something. He said he hoped the Thomas family thought so too, though he understood if they had other things to do with their attention than think about his mother's education. David Thomas went back to Jackson and went back to his classroom. He added the story of that afternoon to the unit he taught on the post-Civil War period and the significance of naming, not as a story about a television show, but as an illustration of why the history he taught was not finished, was not past, was not something that could be stored in the past tense without consequence, was alive in the specific way that things are alive when they still arrive in rooms and still need to be explained, and still produce the expression on his mother's face that he had seen when Marge Anderson's phrase landed. He told his students that history was not only in textbooks. He said it was in names. He said it was in the name Thomas, which his family had carried for 6 generations as evidence of something. He said they should know the names in their own families and what those names carried. Several of his students came to him after class that week to tell him things about their family names that they had not thought about before. He listened to all of them. He had always listened. That was the whole job. Josephine went home to Jackson. She went back to the life she had built in 34 years of second grade and the decades that surrounded it. She called her sister, who was 72 and who had watched the episode when it aired and who had said, when Josephine answered the phone, "Joe." Isaiah would have. And Josephine had said, "I know." They had talked for an hour. They had talked about their grandmother and their grandmother's grandmother and the name that had come down through all of them and what it meant that it was still here, still theirs, still being given to children in the family who would carry it forward. They talked about Maya at Spelman, about what it meant that she was there, about how far the name had traveled from 1865. Josephine said it had always been going to travel that far. She said Isaiah had always been going to have great-great-great-grandchildren at historically Black colleges. She said that had been the point of the name. That had been the point of all of it. The word that was used that afternoon, the phrase, was said from ignorance rather than malice, which is the most charitable and also the most accurate reading of it. But ignorance and malice produce the same sound when they land. They both arrive in a room and require the same thing from the people they land near, which is to decide what to do with the weight. Josephine Thomas had been deciding what to do with that weight her entire life, not because she deserved to have to, but because she had been required to, and because she had found over 68 years that the decision that worked was the decision she had always made. The name is mine. It has always been mine. Nothing anyone says about it changes what it is. That is Isaiah's inheritance. That is Josephine's inheritance. That is what 6 generations of a family carried forward from the moment in 1865 when a man chose his name and chose, in the same act, to be the kind of person who could not be unnamed by anyone who came after him. Steve Harvey said it on a game show stage in the fall of 2024, in front of a studio audience and a camera, and everyone who watched the clip in the weeks that followed. The name is the opposite of slavery. The name is what his family made of themselves at the moment they became free to make anything. That is the whole history. That is the whole name. That is the whole story. You can carry it forward now, too. If this story reached you, if it made you think about what your name carries and where it came from and who gave it to you and what they meant by giving it, sit with that. And then share this with someone who needs to understand why names matter and what they mean and what it costs when they are handled carelessly. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story stirred in you, because this community reads those comments and your voice here matters. And if you are not already with us, subscribe right now, because every single week we come back with stories exactly like this one. Stories about what people carry forward, stories about what names mean, and stories about the rooms that stop and say, listen. Listen to the history in that name. Listen to what it is actually saying. Listen to the people who carry it. They have been here a long time, and they have something to tell you, and you should hear it. We will see you in the next one.